All right, we're at the Library Center on South Campbell. It is November 4th, 2006. We're interviewing Robert Brose. He was born October 3rd, 1929. In attendance at the interview is obviously Bob. Myself, Jay Moline, will be doing the interviewing. Our camera operator is Amy Houston. And recording our tape log is Chris Chasteen. And we are with Julie Johnson's Capstone Course 397, Section 12. I guess, first of all, were you drafted or did you enlist in the Army?
I enlisted.
Enlisted, all right. And when you enlisted, actually, what was the date that you enlisted?
I enlisted on October the 5th of 1946.
All right. Now, was that your choice to enlist? Obviously if you enlisted, it was your choice. But what were the, I guess, kind of the situation at the time that you decided to enlist?
Well, we were living in, family was living in Indiana, and I was a senior in high school at the time, and they were moving out of state. And this was the third high school I'd been in because the family moved a lot. And so I just decided that rather than move again, that I'd like to go in the service. And there was a wave of patriotism going on at that time, and a lot of my buddies were in, dropped out and enlisted. You could enlist when you were 17. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did.
All right, now, and you're saying your family was moving. How did your parents, and you mentioned your friends were enlisting also. How did your parents and kind of your closest family feel about you going in?
Well, we had, my dad had been in the service, and they didn't like it at first, but went along with it.
All right. And when you first enlisted, was there a certain branch that you wanted to join, or were you just placed in a certain branch?
No, I enlisted in the Army.
All right.
My dad was in the Army, so I enlisted in the Army.
Do you recall what your first days, like such as boot camp and other stuff, that your first days of service?
Terrible.
Terrible?
Boot camp was always a shock, especially when you're, 17 years old, kind of cocky anyway. Mm-hmm. And you get to boot camp and meet your first drill sergeant. That's a shock.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember your drill sergeant's name?
Oh yeah, Sergeant Taylor.
All right. How was he compared to some of the other drill sergeants that were?
Pretty nice guy. He had an assistant. He was a staff sergeant, and he had an assistant that was a corporal named Corporal Love. Mm-hmm. And Corporal Love was not one that you'd love.
Mm-hmm. I guess, is there any certain experience from boot camp or training that you remember specifically? Ones that good and bad, I guess?
After the first week or so, I really enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. But we did have a situation. I went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And back in those years, segregation was a pretty big thing. And I remember about the third week, they moved in a black company right across the street from us. And there was quite a few guys in our company that were good old hilly boys, for lack of a better word, got up in the middle of the night and started throwing rocks through their windows across the street, which is really bad. So we all pulled extra duty for a long time because of them. But that calmed down.
And then I guess that's would you consider that a funny experience or something a good or bad experience?
Well, it was a bad experience. My best friend in high school in Indiana was a young black fella. And Tom and I had been friends for quite a while, so it kind of surprised me. I didn't realize there was people like that around. Mm-hmm. I've never had a prejudiced bone in my body.
And then I guess when
there was an enlightening experience, mm-hmm. Let's put it that way.
How did you? I guess boot camp is very tough, as you mentioned. How did you get through boot camp? Were there any superstitions, or was it just kind of what goal you were going for, to eventually see combat, or was that?
Well, that was at peacetime. Of course, the war was over, mm-hmm. and my dad had always been pretty strict with me. So after the first week or so, it was fine, mm-hmm. and I got made a platoon runner, which so I guess the old drill sergeant liked me.
Mm-hmm. Now, could you explain what the platoon runner exactly did?
Well, whenever the sergeant wants something done, you don't do it for him. Pretty much just about anything. Mm-hmm. Run messages back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess, when did you get out of boot camp and go?
It was 13 weeks.
13 weeks. Do you
Yeah.
remember that? Do you remember the exact date, or is it?
No, I don't.
No. All right. Now, which wars did you serve in?
After I got through with training, I went to Japan and the occupation forces for, I was in Japan for 14 months. When I enlisted, they allowed you to enlist for 18 months. They don't do that anymore, but at that time you could, so I had enlisted for 18 months when that was up. Came home from Japan and was in the reserves and went back to North Dakota. And then in October the 8th of 1950, I was recalled to active duty again, sent to Korea.
Now, when you remember what it was like, what Japan was like, and what it was like when you first arrived?
What was?
What Japan was like, and what it was your experience was when you first arrived?
It was a real shock when I got there because that was a terrible war, and of course the atomic bomb had been dropped on Japan. The people were extremely friendly. I was a truck driver for 14 months in Japan, 2.5-ton truck, and I had two Japanese ex-army guys that rode with me. One was could speak a little English, so he was kind of my interpreter. And I was sent out on missions all over Osaka and that whole part of the Japanese islands, and never had any problem with any people. People were just super friendly. I befriended a family over there. Kind of an interesting story. A friend of mine and I were going into Osaka from camp on a rickety old Japanese bus, and we didn't know where we were going. We were lost. That was our first time in town. We were talking about it, and this Japanese girl was sitting in front of us. Back in those days, they wore kimonos. They weren't in Western garb at that time at all, and all the women wore kimonos and had their hair done with bones sticking through it and all that kind of stuff. And she spoke perfect English, absolutely perfect. You guys lost? Let me show you the way. Where do you want to go? And we told her, and so she took us to the building. Anyway, to make a long story short, she gave us her name and phone number at work. So I called her one day, and she met me in town and took me out to their house. And her father was a professor at Osaka University. Spoke beautiful English with a very English accent. He was Japanese, but had 3 daughters, and spent many nice weekends out there home, talking about the war. And he'd never been to the United States, so he was very curious about that.
Now, you had that experience. Was that common among? Do you know if that was common among any other soldiers, or was that?
Oh yeah.
Very common.
Yeah. There was quite a few guys in our outfit that married Japanese girls over there. Never had a problem. They weren't hostile towards us, at all. Some of the young guys were, but they'd never say anything.
Now, you mentioned the atomic bomb before. How, we know how it had an effect on the United States and the effect on Japan. How did were you guys ever aware of what was going on back home at the time? Or
Very little.
Very little?
Because we didn't, television wasn't even around at that time, and the newspapers did a pretty poor job of covering international things at all. I knew that the bomb had been dropped and that type of thing, And of course, my mother was concerned about that, but after getting there, everything was fine. Occupation duty is, if you get into the service, it's pretty nice.
And then you mentioned about that your mom was worried. Did you, yes, since the media was big, how did you stay in touch with your family when you were involved?
Mail. We couldn't telephone back and forth, of course, and mostly just mail. And mail service while I was in Japan was very good.
All right, and then I guess if we want to talk about when you were in Korea, I guess I'm kind of confused about the difference between Japan and Korea. So when you left Japan, you then went to Korea?
No, when I left Japan, I came home.
To North Dakota.
Yeah, to North Dakota. I was placed in the inactive reserves, and then in October of 1950, I was activated. And during that period of time, I went to school in Chicago for a year for electronics studies, and then I hired out on the Great Northern Railway up in Minot. That area up there, the big thing is the railroad. And Minot was a central point for the Great Northern at that time, so I hired out as a fireman on the Great Northern. So when I got called back in the service, I was sent to Korea in a railroad battalion. So I went from the infantry to a railroad battalion. Because the service is pretty careful about analyzing your skills, you know, and they'll put you into what you're most trained to do.
Mm-hmm. And now you said from going to Japan to North Dakota, what was your feelings at the time? Did you want to leave? I guess you had been in for the full 18 months, so we're like, what was the homecoming like in the United States when you came home?
Really uneventful. You know, you came into Fort Lawton and got your train tickets and went home. That's about it. And of course, I'd never lived in Minot before, so I didn't really know anybody there. So I just went out and got a job, went back to work.
And then I guess when you eventually when you were sent back to Korea, did your parents have any feelings that you were going back again?
Well, by that time, we knew that Korea was pretty bad. And there was enough in the newspapers about that they knew that, yeah, she was really concerned when I got called back and sent to Korea.
And what was it like in Korea when you first arrived?
Terrible.
Terrible.
Absolutely terrible. The Korean War was completely misjudged when it started. Harry Truman was the president then. Good old Harry had a lot of disdain for the armed services. And, you know, there's a lot of criticism about the war in Iraq, but the reasons for going to war in both Korea and Vietnam there wasn't any. I mean, it was just the both presidents that started those two wars had this big thing about ridding the world with communism, you know, and so we went to war in Korea. And Korea was, when you compare it to what's happening now, if you can just imagine that, Korea looks like the state of Florida if you look at a map. And in square miles, it's about the size of Minnesota, so it's kind of a small place. We had 252,000 troops on the ground in Korea at the peak of that war. Last 3 years, we lost 36,000 American troops, and there was 50-some thousand Brits that were killed, and the rest were, and we had about 105,000 wounded. There's still 6,000 or 7,000 unaccounted for over in Korea. So it was a pretty bad place. I mean, there was no place to get away from it. And from the minute that I landed in Busan, which is right down at the tip of Korea, and by that time, I got there in December of 1950, and the war started in July of 1950, and the United States and the Brits were pushed all the way back down into Busan, and were getting the landing barges ready to actually leave. And MacArthur came in through Incheon and cut off the North Koreans. The biggest problem over there was that Truman really believed that China would not end the war. Boy, was that a miscalculation. That was terrible. We'd have mopped it up in a hurry if that hadn't happened. But when China entered the war, you know, now we were fighting odds. It was about 30 to 1, which is a pretty tough thing to do. And but we survived. The casualties were terrible. My job on the railroad, I was the railroad was really antiquated. Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945. And so the Koreans had been really beat up a lot by the Japanese while they occupied them. The railroads were terribly antiquated. I never saw anything like that in my life. It was unbelievable. You talk about a honky-tonk railroad. Boy, that was it. All hand-fired coal engines, steam. There wasn't any diesel over there at all. And when I first landed there, I just remember that like it was yesterday. The reported to the rail yard, and my MOS at the time was a engineer, and they split us up in groups of 3 with a whole bunch of MPs guarding the trains, and we hauled munitions and troops up north. That was our job. And the train, that first train, with all the windows were shot out, you know, it was just an absolute mess. I couldn't believe it. You know, and when you're that age, I was 20 years old then. I mean, wow. But managed to survive. 9 months I was there.
Now, you mentioned some of the problems that Truman and other presidents had. Does that affect the morale of the troops at the time?
We didn't even know what was going on. You know, it was such a chaotic mess that was just unbelievable. We didn't have, it was really cold over in Korea. Now, I was fortunate because I'd been living in North Dakota, which is extremely cold, so I got kind of used to it. What I felt sorry for was these guys that were with us that were from the southern part of the United States. And all we had was our fatigues and a field jacket and no coats. And it was like 20, 30 below zero. You know, so we were just terribly ill-equipped. That was a big problem.
Do you feel that was that just the road and some of the infantry, or just the U.S. in general?
U.S. in general.
U.S. in general.
Oh, yeah, all the troops were really in tough shape, equipment-wise. See, we didn't have any body armor back in those days. There wasn't such a thing. The trucks didn't even have doors on them. And now that I've studied the Korean War a lot since then, read all the books on everything in the Vietnam War. It was just completely misjudged by the government at that time. Much worse than this Iraq thing. Underestimated. Thought it was a cakewalk. It didn't turn out to be a cakewalk.
Now, you mentioned that you worked on the railroad. Just for us, could you briefly explain what some of your jobs were on the railroad?
Well, my military operational status, that's MOS, and everybody has one that's in the service, was as a locomotive operator. But the Koreans actually ran the engine, the Korean engineer and Korean fireman, and they had Korean switchmen and Korean brakemen. We were on there mostly just to make sure that they did their job, because they had a tendency when the lead started flying, they'd cut and run. They didn't want to be around for that. So our job was to just keep it going. But I'd take the throttle once in a while.
Now, did you feel any extra added pressure or stress when the fire would come in and kind of the Koreans were decked out? Did you feel any added pressure or anything?
Oh yeah, scared the hell out of you.
Just trying to look for stuff to talk about. You guys have any questions? No.
What about your wife? Like, when did you get married?
I didn't get married till I came home from
So
Korea.
after.
Had a girlfriend when I went to Korea.
That's something we can talk about. Did you?
She got married.
Oh, she got married. Now, did you meet her? Did you meet her while you were in North Dakota in between wars? All right. And how was that when you left to go to Korea? Did she? Teary with that.
You guys know.
Yeah, I don't. We're just searching for stuff to talk about.
We weren't any different back then.
I guess I know we talked about in class about some of the Greeks and the Turks and other people like that. What would you say about who was probably the worst or best fighters? I know.
We always had a mix of troops as MPs on the train, and there'd be about 2 or 3 mounted on each car, riding on top or riding inside for protection, MPs. And the British were pretty fearsome people. I mean, if you had to be in a foxhole with somebody, you'd want either a Brit or a Turk. Turkish were fearsome fighters. Oh boy, Koreans were scared to death of them. And that was mostly what I saw. I didn't see much of any other country. The Brits and the American was the #1 force over there. We usually had over 200,000. The Brits were around 50, 60,000. Great soldiers. The Turks were battalions size, so they're maybe a couple thousand of them. I never saw any French. Some Belgians, I guess, but both in Korea and Vietnam, the majority of the force was American and British.
What was it like when you came back
From Korea? Well, it was a little bit different. People in the United States knew a little bit more about it. They loaded us on trucks in Seattle and drove us through town. People were screaming and hollering, So that was kind of neat.
Did you have any like psychological issues? Did you have like post-traumatic stress disorder? I guess they didn't really have that back then, but
yeah, a lot of us did. And the VA was pretty darn good about the 2 biggest problems the VA has. One of them is psychological disorders, because a lot of us had flashback for a long time. I don't anymore, but yeah.
like nightmares and stuff.
Yeah.
You mentioned in one of the parts I remember most from you coming to class was you mentioned that World War II was different from Korea because you didn't know who your friends were. What did you mean exactly by that?
You can't tell a North Korean from a South Korean, and the North Koreans didn't wear uniforms. The only people that you could really tell over there were the Chinese, because they all looked alike. They all had the same pants and the same shirt on and the same cap on, so you know who Chinese was. But you couldn't tell a North Korean from a South Korean. And the ROKs, the South Korean Army, Republic of Korea, initially were pretty disorganized and afraid. You got to remember, they've been browbeaten for so many years by occupation over there that getting the ROKs to defend their country was a lot like they're going through in Iraq right now. They were disorganized, and the minute things really got tough, they had a tendency to turn and run. But that got better with time. And look how the country turned out now. It's beautiful.
I guess some things we didn't talk about were some of the. Did you ever have any downtime in World War II Korea? When you weren't active, I guess when there wasn't a lot going on, such as you guys do things to entertain yourself, or I know you mentioned traveling earlier.
In Japan,
yeah.
Traveled a lot in Japan. Occupation duty is. I'd recommend that to anybody, regardless of what country you go to, because you really get a chance to travel and meet the people. Korea, there was no chance for that. Just absolutely none. Downtime was when we make a trip from down south to Busan to pick up a new train and go back north again, we'd get a few days off, but there wasn't anything to do, so it was just rest time more than anything else.
Did you guys, did you do anything with fellow soldiers? It was just straight rest. I don't know if you guys played cards or
Sure.
traded stories and
Oh, yeah.
everything.
Oh, yeah. And of course, in my job, we would get up to the front, and when we start back, we'd bring back an awful lot of troops that were being either rotated home or wounded or whatever. So, the whole trip back, I'd spend back in the cars just chatting with the guys about their experiences.
Do you remember those people pretty well that you talked to?
It's kind of a maze, but sure, I remember the stories, all that kind of stuff. And I was never really up on the front lines, and we'd go as far north as we could till the tracks disappeared from being shelled. And the troops would walk down out of the hills and get on the train, and then we'd take them back south again.
What, if you could you just describe some of those stories? Is there any like, specific memorable stories that you remember? Not either yours or that you remember hearing?
The guys never cease to amaze me that the main thing on their mind, especially the guys who were wounded, they wanted to get patched up so they could go back. And many of them have been back up there, I don't know how many times. And, you know, just by comparison, when you look at the numbers, and they talk about Iraq, and God bless the guys that are in Iraq, but, you know, they lose maybe 10, 12, 20 a day. For the whole Korean War, we were losing like on an average of 36, 37, 40 a day. And it was nothing to have a whole company just disappear overnight. So there's stories that the guys that came back, in fact, Doyle, my cameraman who was here, he was in a regimental combat team. A regimental combat team is like the firefighters. When somebody gets overrun, they send in an RCT to fight off the enemy and bail them out. They get through doing that, they go on to another one. They go on to another. You know, it's, if a guy says he was in a regimental combat team and he survived in Korea, it's a miracle.
Now you mentioned that those guys wanted to get patched up. What was the like the hospital and the medic, like how were they? You think they were qualified? Were they good? Because we hear about nowadays, I mean, like you can get on medevac and you're healed right, not really healed right away, but there's good hospitals and like people are qualified. Do you feel that was like that in Japan and Korea?
Well, it was we didn't have, Korea is a terribly hilly country, and it was very, very difficult for planes to get around. Jets couldn't help the ground troops much at all. There was a lot of helicopters around there, but I saw very few because it was so tremendously hilly, you know, to go in between those hills and try to help somebody out. So we have the Army, the Marine Corps, both have excellent medics that are assigned to each company. Each company has their own field medics, and those guys are pretty good. And they had enough. Usually when somebody was severely injured, they'd take them to a back area someplace and then get them on a chopper and take them out to ships that were sitting off the coast of Korea. When I was at the big hospitals, it had all been destroyed, so the only way to get somebody help that was really severely wounded was to fly them out to a ship.
Now, did you keep a personal diary at all while you were?
No, I didn't. I wrote a lot of letters home. I sent a tremendous number of films home, and unfortunately, they all got lost.
Do you know of other soldiers that kept? Was that a big thing for other soldiers to keep personal diaries?
Yes. Yeah, I've got two friends that. One of them, did Denzel Batson come to one of your classes?
Yeah.
Denzel wrote the book, and he had took a lot of notes and had an amazing memory, so that he could write that book. How Denzel ever survived is a miracle, and he knows that. He knows that somebody was looking out over him.
I guess from the service. Do you remember when you left Korea? Do you remember the day you left Korea?
Yeah. Very well. I don't remember what the date was, but I was up north by Seoul, and one of the other trains came through, and one of the guys said, "Brose, what are you still doing here? Your name's on the bulletin board, Busan. You've been rotated." I said, "Well, you know, thanks a lot." So I went all the way back to Busan. Well, the next trip, I had to wait till we made the next trip back, which took a couple of weeks, and I put into our battalion headquarters and was told, "No, I'm sorry, but somebody made a mistake. By the way, there's your train out there going back up north again." So I got back up there. "What are you doing here?" "You've been rotated home." So I went back to Busan, and this time it stuck. They put me on a ship, and I went back to the States.
You mentioned a bulletin board. Was that how you found out Like how, I guess if could you describe that a little bit?
Well, in headquarters, every headquarters has a big bulletin board, and you want to be sure and check the bulletin board because communications over there, we didn't have. If you can imagine not having your cell phone, you're lost. The only way we ever got to communicate with anybody is we'd stop at a rail station, and maybe the wires were cut, and maybe the wires weren't cut. And if there was a GI that happened to be in there, because most of those stations were just all demolished. Everything from, when I was there, everything from Busan up past Seoul, all the way up to the 38 parallel was pretty well leveled.
And then when you came back home, did you arrive back in North Dakota? Or?
Yep, went back to North Dakota. Or no, I'm sorry. My, just before I came home, my mother moved to Minneapolis. My parents were separated at that time. My mother moved to Minneapolis, so when I came home, expecting to go to North Dakota, no, you got to go to Minneapolis. So that's where I went back to, and that's I went back to Minneapolis, went back on the Great Northern Railroad, got married.
I guess, what was it like those few weeks or months afterwards? Was it a relief, or did you just dive back into the railroad, or was there a downtime that you had?
Yeah, there was a few weeks when just had to unwind.
I guess obviously I feel like I should ask this question. Obviously you made close friendships during the service. Do you keep in touch with some of those? I know we mentioned Doyle, but are there other veterans that you stay in touch with?
That were actually on the railroad up there since the ones that were actually there when I was there have all passed away. But I've befriended some that were on the railroad up there at the same time I was, but I didn't know them while we were in Korea. Most of them came after I did. I was the outfit I was in was just being formed when I was assigned to it, and these guys who were all railroaders from parts of the United States came over after I did, and we still communicate. I call them periodically. It's been quite a while now, but they're getting kind of aged.
Now, are you a member of any veterans organizations or anything?
The American Legion and the Korean War Veterans Association.
And how often do you guys meet often to talk about or just share stories or anything? Do you guys hold events or anything?
I'm not active with the Legion. I belong to it because I like to contribute to the cause. The Legion does an awful lot for veterans nationally, and they have lobbyists in Washington D.C. that are fighting for us constantly. It's the biggest organization, the American Legion. Korean War Vets. I'm the financial officer for the chapter here in Springfield, and we go out to the veterans home at Mount Vernon every month and do whatever we can for Korean veterans that pass away here in the Springfield area. And we have picnics and gatherings with our wives a few times a year.
And you mentioned that you went back to the Northern Railroad. How long did you stay with the railroad after you?
Not very long. I met my wife and we got married. And the railroad, you're away from home a lot. Great job for a single guy. Make a lot of money, and if you like to travel, you couldn't be doing a better thing. But after I got married, I forgot education-wise while I was in Japan. One thing that the military does for you is they still have international correspondence school courses that you can take. I just asked one of the recruiting sergeants the other day about that. I took a course in electric and radio repair from international correspondence schools while I was in Japan, and I also took a course. I got to remember, I was 17 years old at the time. All was like locomotives. So I took a course in steam locomotive service and operation. And actually, when I got back to the States and got that job on the Great Northern up in Minot, I was the youngest fireman that they'd ever hired. because I had taken that ICS course just on a whim while I was over in Japan. So that really helped. And then after I got off the railroad in Minneapolis, because I had taken that electrical course on ICS and went to school for a year in Chicago, I got a job in the television and radio repair field and did that for a while and got into other things.
And you're retired now. You mentioned meeting your wife. How did that come about? Did that come about like, did you guys meet after Japan, or like did you meet through the railroad, or?
No, as a matter of fact, when I came to Minneapolis, and of course my mother had an apartment there, and I moved in with her. And my wife and her family lived downstairs on the first floor. It was a 3-floor building. And used to pass her all the time. She was kind of cute, you know.
I guess kind of getting back to about what we have in Iraq. I remember reading in Shin's book that 36 news people and photographers were to attend, and Truman said that the war was only going to last like 4 days, and so 6 out of like the 30 people only attended, and that kind of like tainted how we in the United States felt about the war. Do you think that still goes on, or how is like what you know about war was like and what you see that's reported in Iraq? Has that changed your feelings about war at all?
Well,
Or I guess how does your military and army influence affect how like you see the war now, or what's going on?
I keep looking for a president. I voted for both parties over the years. And I keep looking for a president that'll spend a lot more time concentrating on the United States of America and quit trying to go out and save the world. And I'm not talking about becoming an isolationist. But the Korean War was started for no reason at all. You know, we weren't attacked. Harry just wanted to rid the world of communism, so we lost 59,000 troops. John Kennedy, who I voted for, turned right around and he put the first troops in Vietnam. Those people are no problem whatsoever. Completely misjudged the whole thing, just like Harry did. And now we're in the same thing again. Only this time, I'll defend the cause because this is the first time in the history outside of the Civil War here in the United States that we were attacked. We lost 3,000 people on 9/11, and I can't forget that. And I don't have any patience for our politicians that are bad-mouthing the efforts. This time around, the Korean War, everybody advised against going in there right at the very beginning, but Harry did it anyway. Okay, Vietnam War, everybody said don't do that, but you know between Kennedy and Johnson, we ended up in there. 59,000 people died in Vietnam. 300,000 severely injured. You know, I mean, good God. This time we got attacked, and there was an awful lot of countries, as well as the majority of our politicians in Washington, that thought it was the right thing to do. Now, I have no patience at all for Monday morning quarterbacks. Any idiot can turn around and say, well, I would have never done that. You know, it doesn't take a brain in your head to do that. I wish we weren't there. And you can always say, knowing what I know now, well, of course you wouldn't have done it if you knew what you know now. You know, Harry wouldn't have done it. Kennedy wouldn't have done it. Bush wouldn't have done it. But the thing that's, and I have to say this, the thing that's most disturbing to me is an awful lot of, I remember not too long ago, I was up on Chestnut Expressway and there was a bunch of protesters up there, and I saw this fellow that was, I thought he was late 20s, maybe 30ish, had a sign that said, no more wars unless the president's a Democrat. So I pulled my car over and I went up to the guy and I said, tell me, I said, you know, that's really interesting. What did you have in mind when you said that? Well, if we had a, you know, and he started on that stuff. And I started asking him about Korea and Vietnam, which he knew nothing about at all. And I just hope that down the track, for you guys' benefit, when you get to be my age, that we've got somebody that pays more attention to. I used to live in Chicago. I used to travel in New York area a lot. You ever been there?
I've been in New York once.
Have you been out in the slums?
No, I stayed at a hotel in Times Square for like the trip.
Okay, yeah.
But the most
Wonderful
experience
place
I've had
to
is a
visit.
cab ride. So
You should go out in the suburbs in New York. You wouldn't believe it. You think Iraq looks bad. It's terrible. And I lived in Chicago for a while. It's absolutely unbelievable. I lived in down in Florida. And that Tampa and Miami area,
oh,
it's
bad,
unbelievable.
And we lived in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which was the nicest part of Florida.
Well, I
You've
live
been
in
to Miami.
Clearwater, which is
Yeah.
nice. But you get off the beaten track and it's something else.
All right, well, I think-
So anyway,
I guess, yeah, this kind of goes back to that question earlier. Is there anything you'd like to add? Or anything we didn't cover that you think needs to be covered? Or, I mean, we'll get the photographs here and you can discuss those, but other than that.
not really unless you think of something. I think I've said just about enough.
Yeah, I would say that.
Support the veterans,
Mhm.
especially the guys that were in Korea and Vietnam. My goodness gracious. There's some awfully good books out there on the subject too. You don't base your opinions on what you see on television. Oh my.
I would agree. All right.
Anyway, I brought a couple of photographs here, and the question usually comes up about time ago. So this is the first time on. Are you filming this?
Yeah.
That's my dad, and that's me. I was 17 there. I don't know how old that was taken in either 1917 or 1918.
Did you drop out of high school?
Yeah.
Did you finish your degree later?
Oh, yeah. And I was taken in Osaka, Japan.
Wow.
Right after I got there. And this is a picture of my son.
Oh, we didn't even ask you about any children.
Phil spent 20 years in the Marine Corps. He's a gunnery sergeant when he retired, and he's got a tremendous job now in Houston, Texas. He's or Fort Worth. I'm sorry, Fort Worth, as a computer instructor for a major Japanese firm. And here's his son and my grandson. He is his son.
Exactly alike.
And he's Phil.
I would have actually guessed they were probably the same person.
Phil had a career in avionics while he was in the Marine Corps, which is electrical systems in aircraft. And that's exactly what Japan on the first time around. Admiral H.T. Mayo. And that was really a clunker. Everybody was deathly ill. That's me in boot camp. I know what we did in boot camp back in those days. You peeled the potatoes by hand. And Corporal Love put us on KP
Oh,
there.
yeah.
I'll never forget that kid. 5. Who's that?
I have no idea.
Julie knew. That's why she's a professor.
Yeah.
Can't say.
That's Sharon. Ariel Sharon, the Prime Minister of Israel,
Oh, wow.
who is just about on death's bed now. But Phil was an embassy guard in the embassy in Tel Aviv, Israel. And he said that Sharon was one of the nicest guys. That he used to come there quite frequently. And he said he was just the nicest guy. The government has really gotten involved in the past few years in trying to do things for veterans. And the state of Missouri issued these certificates to That was from Roy Blunt's office,
Mhm.
which is pretty nice. There was a formal presentation that I got my picture taken with Roy and a bunch of other politicians that needed some camera time. And here's one from the, oh, that's another one from Roy Blunt. Roy was pretty active. This is an interesting one from this. Yeah, this is the one. You had to have been in the Korean War to get that medal, which was pretty nice, and it was given to us in English and Korean, which is pretty nice. This one was awarded from the United States government also to the veterans of the Korean War. You had to be actually in the war to receive that one. And this one, because I qualified for this because I came right in. This is the World War II Victory Medal, which was awarded to veterans that were in the service after a certain period of time. And these ribbons, this is World War II Victory Medal. This is the occupation of Japan. This is the Korean War Medal, and that was awarded by the president of South Korea to veterans that were in Korea during the war. These are what's called commonly, well, they're battle stars, campaign stars is what they're called. If you're in a major campaign in a combat area, you get a star. And there was 5 campaigns in Korea, and lucky me, I was in 3 of them. And see that picture? No. Oh, I'm talking about Japan. These pictures here were taken. That was me in Japan. That was the regiment that I was in. There was the 27th Infantry Wolfhound Regiment, which was pretty famous in Korea. I was in them in Japan, but when they were in Korea, they were pretty famous over there. And that's my truck that I drove for all that time in Japan. And that was Papa-san. He rode with me the whole time, and he was in the Japanese Army during the peak of the war. Got to be my very good friend. That picture there, that's me in the middle, was taken right at the bottom of Mount Fujiyama in Japan. That's a postcard picture. I just stuck that in there because you couldn't see this one very, very clearly, but we were on maneuvers there right at the base of Mount Fujiyama, which is quite an awesome place to be.